Hello, Queensland Storyteller time. I'm Kim Dodsworth. Now, The Loaded Dog by Henry Lawson is deservedly an Australian classic. Let's all have a laugh. It'll do us good. Dave Regan, Jim Bentley and Andy Page were sinking a shaft at Stony Creek in search of a rich gold quartz reef which was supposed to exist in the vicinity. There's always a rich reef supposed to exist in the vicinity. The only questions are whether it's 10 feet or hundreds beneath the surface, and in which direction. They'd struck some pretty solid rock, also water, which kept them bailing. They used the old-fashioned blasting powder and time fuse. They'd make a sausage or cartridge of blasting powder in a skin of strong calico or canvas, the mouth sewn and bound round the end of the fuse. They'd dip the cartridge in melted tallow to make it watertight, get the drill hole as dry as possible, drop in the cartridge with some dry dust, and wad and ram with stiff clay and broken brick. Then they'd light the fuse and get out of the hole and wait. The result was usually an ugly pothole in the bottom of the shaft and half a barrow load of broken rock. There was plenty of fish in the creek, freshwater bream, cod, catfish and tailors. The party were fond of fish, and Andy and Dave are fishing. Dave got an idea. "Why not blow the fish up in the big water hole with a cartridge?" he said. "I'll try it." He thought the thing out, and Andy Page worked it out. Andy usually put Dave's theories into practice if they were able, or bore the blame for the failure and the chaffing of his mates if they weren't. He made a cartridge about 3 times the size of those they used in the rock. Jim Bentley said it was big enough to blow the bottom out of the river. The cartridge was rigid and solid enough now, a formidable bomb, but Andy and Dave wanted to be sure. Andy sewed on another layer of canvas, dipped the cartridge in melted tallow, twisted a length of fencing wire round it as an afterthought, dipped it in tallow again, and stood it carefully against a tent peg where he'd know where to find it, and wound the fuse loosely around it. Then he went to the campfire to try some potatoes which were boiling in their jackets in a billy, and to see about frying some chops for dinner. Dave and Jim were at work in the claim that morning. They had a big black young retriever dog, or rather an overgrown pup, a big foolish 4-footed mate who was always slobbering round them and lashing their legs with his heavy tail that swung round like a stockwhip. Most of his head was usually a red, idiotic, slobbering grin of appreciation of his own silliness. He seemed to take life, the world, his 2-legged mates, and his own instinct as a huge joke. He'd retrieve anything. He carted back most of the camp rubbish that Andy threw away. He watched Andy with great interest all the morning making the cartridge, and hindered him considerably, trying to help. But about noon he went off to the claim to see how Dave and Jim were getting on, and to come home to dinner with them. Andy saw them coming, and put a panful of mutton chops on the fire. Andy was cook today. Dave and Jim stood with their backs to the fire, as bushmen do in all weathers, waiting till dinner should be ready. The retriever went nosing round after something he seemed to have missed. Dave glanced over his shoulder to see how the chops were doing, and bolted. He explained afterwards that he thought he heard the pan sputtering extra, and looked to see if the chops were burning. Jim Bentley looked behind and bolted after Dave. Andy stood stock still, staring after them. "Run, Andy, run!" they shouted back at him. "Run! Look behind you, you fool!" Andy turned slowly and looked, and there, close behind him, was the retriever with the cartridge at his mouth, wedged into his broadest and silliest grin. And that wasn't all. The dog had come round the fire to Andy, and the loose end of the fuse had trailed and waggled over the burning sticks into the blaze. Andy had slit and nicked the firing into the fuse well, and now it was hissing and spitting properly. Andy's legs started with a jolt. His legs started before his brain did, and he made after Dave and Jim, and the dog followed Andy. Dave and Jim were good runners, Jim the best, for a short distance, and Andy was slow and heavy, but he had the strength and the wind, and could last. The dog capered round him, delighted as a dog could be to find his mates, as he thought, on for a frolic. Dave and Jim kept shouting back, don't follow us, you coloured fool!" But Andy kept on, no matter how they dodged. They could never explain any more than the dog why they followed each other, but so they ran, Dave keeping in Jim's track in all its turnings, Andy after Dave, and the dog circling around Andy, the live fuse swishing in all directions and hissing and spluttering and stinking. Jim yelling to Dave not to follow him, Dave shouting to Andy to go in another direction, to spread out, and Andy roaring at the dog to go home. "Go away, Tommy," said Jim feebly. "Go away." The dog bounded off after Dave, who was the only one in sight now. Andy had dropped behind a log where he lay flat on his face, having suddenly remembered a picture of the Russo-Turkish War with a circle of Turks lying flat on their faces, as if they were ashamed, round a newly arrived shell. There was a small hotel or shanty on the creek, on the main road not far from the claim. Dave was desperate. The time flew much faster in his stimulated imagination than it did in reality as he made for the shanty. There were several casual bushmen on the veranda and in the bar. Dave rushed into the bar, banging the door to behind him. "My dog!" he gasped in reply to the astonished stare of the publican. "The blanky retriever! He's got a live cartridge in his mouth!" The retriever, finding the front door shut against him, had bounded around and in by the back way, and now stood smiling in the doorway leading from the passage, the cartridge still in his mouth and the fuse spluttering. They burst out of that bar. Tommy bounded first after one and then after another, for being a young dog, he tried to make friends with everybody. The bushmen ran around corners, and some shut themselves in the stable. There was even a new weatherboard and corrugated iron kitchen and washhouse on piles in the backyard, with some women washing clothes inside. Dave and the publican bundled in there and shut the door. The publican cursing Dave and calling him a bloody fool in hurried tones and wanting to know what the hell he came here for. The retriever went in under the kitchen amongst the piles, but luckily for those inside, there was a vicious yellow mongrel cattle dog sulking and nursing his nastiness under there, a sneaking, fighting, thieving canine whose neighbours had tried for years to shoot or poison. Tommy saw his danger. He had had experience from this dog, and started out across the yard, still sticking to the cartridge. Halfway across the yard, the yellow dog caught him and nipped him. Tommy dropped the cartridge, gave one terrified yell and took to the bush. The yellow dog followed him to the fence and then ran back to see what he had dropped. Nearly a dozen other dogs came from round all the corners and under the buildings. Spidery, thievish, cold-blooded kangaroo dogs, mongrel sheep and cattle dogs, vicious black and yellow dogs that slip after you in the dark, nip your heels and vanish without explaining, and yapping, yelping small fry. They kept at a respectable distance round the nasty yellow dog, for it was dangerous to go near him when he thought he had found something which might be good for a dog or cat. He sniffed at the cartridge and was just taking a third cautious sniff when... It was a very good blasting powder, a new brand that Dave recently got up from Sydney, and the cartridge had been excellently well made. Andy was very patient and painstaking in all he did, and nearly as handy as the average sailor with needles, twine, canvas and rope. Bushmen say that kitchen jumped off its piles and on again. When the smoke and dust cleared away, the remains of the nasty yellow dog were lying against the paling fence of the yard, looking as if he had been kicked into a fire by a horse and afterwards rolled in the dust under a barrow and finally thrown against the fence from a distance. Several saddle horses, which had been hanging up round the veranda, were galloping wildly down the road in clouds of dust. Broken bridle reins flying, and from a circle around the outskirts, from every point of the compass in the scrub, came the yelping of dogs. 2 of them went home to the place they were born, 30 miles away, and reached it the same night and stayed there. It was not till towards evening the rest came back cautiously to make inquiries. One was trying to walk on 2 legs, and most of them looked more or less singed, and a little singed, stumpy-tailed dog, who had been in the habit of hopping the back half of him along on 1 leg, had reason to be glad that he'd saved up the other leg all those years, for he needed it now. There was one old, one-eyed cattle dog round that shanty for years afterwards who couldn't stand the smell of a gun being cleaned. He it was who had taken an interest, only second to that of the yellow dog, in the cartridge. Bushmen said that it was amusing to slip up on his blind side and stick a dirty ramrod under his nose. He wouldn't wait to bring his solitary eye to bear. He'd take to the bush and stay out all night. For half an hour or so after the explosion, there were several bushmen round behind the stable who crouched, doubled up against the wall, or rolled gently on the dust, trying to laugh without shrieking. There were 2 white women in hysterics at the house, and a half-caste rushing aimlessly round with a dipper of cold water. The publican was holding his wife tight and begging her between her squawks to "Hold up for my sake, Mary, or I'll lam the life out of you." Dave decided to apologise later on when things had settled a bit and went back to camp. And the dog that had done it all, Tommy, the great idiotic mongrel retriever, came slobbering around Dave and lashing his legs with his tail, and trotted home after him, smiling his broadest, longest and reddest smile of amiability, and apparently satisfied for one afternoon with the fun he'd had.